So now that my novel's out, I am finally, hopefully, starting to catch up on a ever-increasing backlog of commissioned reviews. First up, the one that is embarrassingly overdue, and that is a review of the novel Excession by Iain M. Banks. Now, this is the second of his books in the Culture series that I've read. I don't know which comes first. The other one I read was Player of Games. But honestly, you don't need to read these in any chronological order. And my understanding of the series as a whole is you don't really get recurring characters. It's just about this sci-fi futuristic civilization as a whole. So a little bit like Isaac Asimov's Foundation series in that way. You know, you don't have recurring characters necessarily. So, yeah, this took me a long time to get through. And part of that was my own fault. Part of that is just because, honestly, I am out of practice and just being used to reading a physical book. And normally, when it takes me this long, I'll, at least for parts of it, use an audiobook to get ahead and not fall behind. Problem is, you can't actually get an audio edition of this particular one in America. For some weird rights reasons I wasn't able to untangle. It honestly might be just as well, because given the structure of the book and the way that it's written, I suspect it would actually be way more confusing just to hear it read, because there's usually certain things that are just visual signifiers to let you know certain shifts about what's going on or who's talking that are just, they're not words. So, unless they did some serious adaptation, the audiobook might be borderline unintelligible at parts. So maybe I actually dodged a bullet on that. But the other reason why it took me so long to read this is dense. Like, Player of Games was nothing to sneeze at. Had a lot of ideas and a lot of complicated notions in it. But this has that in spades, and it's all way more intricately woven into the actual narrative than Player of Games was. Which, while it made it harder for me to get through, that doesn't mean that I like it less. I actually like this more than Player of Games. I think just because, since I'm not excessively, or hadn't been previously, with the Culture as a fictional civilization or as a book series, I felt like this gave me so much more and felt like it explored the concepts unique to this franchise way, way more than Player of Games did. Player of Games was closer to almost a fish out of water story, with really one major character from the Culture who was, dealing with this other civilization, and most of the information we got was a lot more about them. So I enjoyed this because it gave me a much stronger sense of who the Culture are, how they operate, or some of the ways that they don't. I can't go into detail trying to explain this. There are massive wikis out there to try and make sense of this thing. But again, that's not to say that I didn't understand it. I did. There is one thing about the way that it's written, before I start to get into the narrative and my thoughts on that I do want to give a genuine heads up, because this did make it genuinely hard for me, but I don't want to say it as a objective criticism, more as just because of me and the way my brain processes and the way I read, it made things hard. So in this book, there's a lot of characters if you count sentient artificial intelligences as characters, and I'm inclined to do so. The upshot of that is there is a whole bunch of ships that are of varying sizes and utility, and they have, honestly, really interesting names. You know, things like the Sleeper Service, the Problem Child, the Not Invented Here, the Fate Amenable to Change, the Gray Area. These really interesting, neat names for ships. But the problem is, you really only know and identify these minds, as they're called, the intelligences behind these ships, as just the names. Like, you don't really get much of they are just minds. Like, they control ships, and that's their primary identity, but you don't really get too many descriptions of the ships themselves, and it would be hard to differentiate them even if you did. So it's really just the names, and I had trouble keeping straight who was who. And again, it didn't make it impossible because for most of the time, if you can like kind of sort them into a couple of categories, like, all right, here are the ones kind of doing this, here are the ones kind of doing that. All right, I can keep track of it. But every now and then I would read one, I'm like, crap, which one is that? And like, I wouldn't remember what things that mind had done previously. Which is one of the reasons that especially like film and television is kind of my preferred medium at times, because I'm visually, my memory works much better. I can remember faces quite well. Remembering names, like just names when I have nothing visual to associate it with, that's tough. That's tough for me. So that was the one element of it that was actually difficult for me to read and keep track of. Again, though, that may or may not be a problem for you, depending on your own, way of processing the written word. So, having said all that, what's this about? Well, it's about a couple of things. I'm going to try and avoid too many spoilers. There's some stuff I'm going to have to get into a little bit. But primarily it's dealing with two major plot lines that are connected, but it's weird. So there is the titular Excession. Now, what that is, it is just this event, for lack of a better word, in space. It's this thing that all these mines and these ships, they can detect it, they can kind of measure it, they don't know exactly what it is. It seems to possibly be hostile. They suspect it is likely from literally another like dimension or universe, and it is probably some sort of vastly superior technology, but they just don't know what to do about it. Some of them want to study it, some of them want to try and communicate it, some of them want to try and blow it up. There's arguments going on amongst the minds that have become aware of this thing. And it does at the very least appear to be very powerful and potentially dangerous. So there's this thing that there's a lot of interest in and a lot of nerves sort of worked up about. Separate from that, you have your lead human character named, oh God, I hope I don't butcher these names, but I might. Bayer Granar Hofon. I'm just going to probably refer to him as the guy, because there's two main human characters in this. There's the man and there's the woman. So he's a diplomat of sorts. And when we first meet him, he is hanging out with this race called the Affront. And I kind of love the Affront. They are wonderfully over the top. They make me think a little bit like a mashup of the Vogons and the Klingons. They're incredibly battle and war-minded, but they're just weird, and like they're like blobby and gaseous, and they've got sort of tentacles and beaks, but they're all into the glory of the fight and all of this, and it's not even like in a For Honor Klingon way. It's more of it's like the way you kind of envision the Vikings, like, a fight? Yeah! Like, that's just what gets them energized. And I kind of love them. Like, as a species, and the specific ones that we meet, I actually really enjoy them. And it's actually sort of your initial hook in with this lead character, because he also has an affinity for them. And he's like, the culture doesn't like that you lot exist, and it really doesn't know what to do with you. But I kind of like you. And I'm kind of looking at how the Affront going, yeah, kind of the same. I get why they're a problem, like to just have around. But yeah, no, good spirited. I like them. But he gets recruited to go meet up with what is known as an eccentric. So this is one of the interesting sort of ins and outs about how this society works. The mines, these ships, they are fully autonomous, and they can, and like some of these are very old. Some of these ships are hundreds of years old. So this civilization has been going for a long time. And some ships have at various points been known to what's called go eccentric, and just kind of go off and do something that isn't really for the sake of the culture and doesn't really make a lot of sense by any logical measure, but it's just, the ship's decided it's just going to do that. Well, this particular ship, in that case, the Sleeper Service, there is a mission given to our lead character to go and board that in order to recover someone who's kind of in suspended animation there. And so we get a little bit of insight into how particularly a branch of the culture called special circumstances works, which is basically kind of like their version of like the CIA. The skullduggery, the stuff that the culture, for all of its high-minded, we are superior and intellectual, and we are the height of civilization in this universe. Sometimes there's still dirty, underhanded work that needs to be done. That's what special circumstances is for. And then the other primary character, I'm going to pronounce it Dajil. Don't know if that's correct. She is actually on board the Sleeper Service and has been for some time. And so the two of them have a history that becomes relevant later on. It's a lengthy book, but very little of it felt like a slog. Although there were bits that felt, I'm not sure why that's there. But, I mean, other than to just sort of, as a narrative indulgence, to give more of a picture of not only the culture, but like the diversity of it. What I liked about this book in terms of depicting the culture as a whole is you really do get a much grander picture of the minds, the fact that they do disagree, that they can start to have their own agenda, that there are elements of, within the culture that sometimes come and go, and some people actually leave the culture, and the culture lets them do that. You have different groups like, I think the Alench, if I'm remembering correctly. Like, I might get some of these names confused or conflated. Were once part of the culture, but sort of broke off because they wanted to pursue sort of a different way of doing things than strictly what the culture would do. But at the same time, it gives us a much more microcosm view of just life day to day on some of these stations, outposts, and ships, where we get a picture of not just these two lead characters who I've mentioned, but just in general what life in the culture is like. And frankly, it's pretty hedonistic at times, which I suppose is an interesting way to have it feel a bit like the near utopia of something like Star Trek, while being much more honest about baser human desires. Because one of the things that can make you kind of go about Star Trek, especially early Star Trek, the classic and the Next Generation, is that Gene Roddenberry seemed to have this very weird idea that human beings would just become better and like rise above their baser instincts. And I'm like, dude, have you met people? So the way it's depicted in the culture is much more that the running of this near utopian society is largely handled by the minds. It's handled by the artificial intelligences, which means the people are free to just indulge whatever the heck they want to do, which, yeah, often is pretty hedonistic for a lot of them. But humans now have, because of medical technologies and other things that humans can now do, or have been enabled to do, they live much, much, much longer. So you also kind of feel eventually a lot of you grow out of this, I kind of suspect. And we even get little hints of that in a few places. So the main thing that's sort of both interesting and odd, and I went back and forth on my thoughts on this overall. I'm not into spoilers yet, don't worry. What was the fact that you have this big story with big ramifications about the Excession. Then you have what ultimately is a much smaller story about Gunnar Hofo and Dajil. And while they're not unconnected, they're very loosely connected. And I found myself wondering, like, is there a reason that both of these are in the same story? Because it almost feels like two things stuck into one space. By the end, I decided that I liked it, and here's why. Because the Excession part of the story is dealing with these big sci-fi concepts. These concepts of higher and lower universes, of high-end technologies of the minds of these ships and what they are capable of and the ways in which they communicate and disagree. It's a lot of big, complicated concepts in that. Whereas ultimately the story between Gunnar Haffoen and Degil is just about people. And I think that the presence of that helps balance the bigger, more heady sci-fi concepts of the Excession plotline. And it's like a sorbet. It's like a cleanser. You get some of this, you get stuff that makes your head spin, and then we go and deal with this other story that's smaller and about people and humans and human reactions and is frankly more relatable most of the time. And it kind of grounds you again. And that it's like the book has built in its own breather from the big heady stuff. And it actually kind of balances well. I'm not going to say that it couldn't have been more integrated than it is or more thematically linked than at least I understood it to be. You know, understanding that I might have missed stuff. But I could have done that a little bit better. But ultimately, I think this actually was a good pairing of stories. There is one specific aspect in regards to the Gunnar Haffoen and Degil. I really hope I'm not butchering these names because I'm going to keep saying them now. I said I was just going to say the man and the woman. I'm like, I feel stupid saying that. I feel even stupider than if I'm getting these names wrong. So I need to talk a little bit about some aspects of their story that is going to be more spoilerish, kind of. Like, it's not like there are massive surprises in their storyline and what happens, but the stuff I'm going to talk about is a lot of stuff that is established much later in the book. So in terms of when it ends up happening, I would count it as a spoiler. So overall, if you like heady sci-fi or if you've read other Iain M. Banks books and enjoyed it and haven't read this, I would actually recommend it. This, if you can sort of wrap your head around these concepts well enough, and like, I don't claim to understand them completely, so I didn't even have to fully wrap my head around these things to still get enjoyment out of it. So I do recommend it. But it is dense. There's a lot. just know that. I mean, not just the fact that it's 500 pages, but just each of those pages, like, it's a lot. So one of the aspects, we're getting into spoilers now, one of the aspects of the culture is that humans have the ability to change sex. Not gender, actual biological sex. It's part of the advances that have gone on with human beings. They are able to basically just decide, you know, if they have been a man, like, I want to be a woman. And it's not instantaneous, but a biological shift begins to happen. And then after a few months, that person is a woman with a womb, can bear a child, even though they were once a man. And it goes the other direction as well. So the backstory with Gunnar Haffoen and Degil is that they were lovers previously, and there was a time when they were going to both have each other's children, and they were actually gestating those children at the same time. Degil was further along, but and they have the ability to to sort of pause the gestation of the fetus if they so desire. And there's a falling out. I'm not going to go into super detail on this, but let's go with falling out for now. There's some really interesting concepts. But I'm a little bit iffy on the fact that it really does feel like ultimately, despite this freedom of gender and sexual expression and existence, that ultimately the book does come down in what feel like fairly traditional gender roles, which was a little disappointing. So to get a little bit more specific. So, Gunnar Haffoen, going by Bayer, which is his first name, and he went by that when he was existing as a woman, she cheated on Degil. And Degil took that very, 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 very badly. And so badly that she froze the gestation of her child for 40 years and basically sulked on a ship for 40 years while Bayer went back to being a man, and then as Gunnar Hafoen just went back to a fairly loose, semi-hedonistic existence. And what I mean by traditional gender roles is even while existing as a woman, Gunnar Hafoen has what feels like a very masculine lapse. It feels written as a man in terms of the way that he finds himself, well, she finds herself in a situation where she ends up cheating. And then the confrontation afterwards where she's saying, well, look, we never said we were exclusive. And all these other, it feels very much written as a man despite being a woman. And I'm kind of two minds on this because, on the one hand, I think it's probably strong in that fundamentally becoming a different sex isn't going to change who you are. Forget biology, but as a person, you're going to be more or less the same person with some adjustments. I mean, look, I know from experience at this point that estrogen kind of impacts your behavior and perceptions a little bit different from testosterone. So, but even short of that, even with that in the mix, fundamentally you are still the same person. So it does make sense that if Gunnar Hafoen has spent most of his life as a man, was born as a man, has done most of his living and his understanding of the world and approaches the world as a man, becoming a woman doesn't suddenly change his behavior. I get that. But then again, as I said, it really feels very much like traditional gender roles. Whether he is a man or a woman, he's the philandering guy who can't commit. And Dajil is the woman scorned. And they fit very solidly into those roles. And I don't want to make them seem like shallow characters. They're not. Actually, all of the characters and dialogue is written extremely well. And actually extremely human and natural sounding, which is a delight in a book this heady with sci-fi concepts like this. I always kind of dread very dry dialogue, like it's a bunch of engineers, just talking shop all the time. And that's not the case at all. But despite that, they feel very rooted in traditional gender roles. And sort of unfortunately adding to that, there's another character named Ulver, who, while not the same traditional feminine gender role, does fit another one, which is she's a party girl. And she is very much that. And while it's a different female archetype from Dajil as the woman scorned, it's frustrating to see such an interesting concept in terms of the sexual relations between characters to ultimately still feel at its heart like very traditional gender roles, despite all that. So that's where to a certain extent, I have to take into account, this stuff wasn't written just this recently. It's over 10 years old. I forget the exact year it was published, but it's very forward thinking in terms of its concepts. The execution and the characterization of the people involved, unfortunately, specifically when it comes to gender issues in particular, feels a little bit dated. It doesn't wreck it by any means, but obviously as somebody with an interest in the way in which gender affects characters and people and storytelling, I think it could have done a lot more than it did. It does a lot narratively with the concept in terms of how the ability of these people to change from man to woman impacts their lives and the narrative. Absolutely. It doesn't skimp on narrative impact, but as far as just gender depictions and showing just something other than the male and female roles that we have now, it feels like a missed opportunity. So it's well utilized narratively, but it's also very shallow as far as what it actually has to say about men or women. Because ultimately these characters are falling into very, very well-worn, stock, gendered characterizations. And again, not even bad characters for it, but just a little frustrating, a little disappointing on that. But that's really my only substantive complaint. And again, me being me, other people might not have that issue at all. But I can only come at this with the perspective that I have. That's what I've got. I did enjoy the book, and I do recommend it. And I am so sorry to the patron who commissioned me that this took me so freaking long. You have been exceedingly patient. Thank you. I am sorry. But have you read Excession? Have you read anything else in the Culture series or by Iain M. Banks? Did anything that I talked about make you think of any other sci-fi books, movies, whatever that you want to say something about, recommend, what have you? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Like, share, subscribe. I got links to my Patreon where, yes, the link's in the description, and you can commission me to review stuff, and hopefully the wait time for that will start to narrow. Hopefully, maybe. We'll see. In any case, there's all that stuff to do, but no pressure. Because we take a relaxed attitude around here. So just come on back next time you need a break.